So we actually have some time now for questions. So I invite you to raise your hand. You were very fast. Go.
Using Martin's sort of taxonomy of 8 steps, one is really for Martin and for Michael. You seem to have a reticence, essentially forcing authors to making the ORCID idea required. So it seems to me that once you've basically committed to step 1, that ORCID is a strategic identifier. Having basic implementation of that is required to go to step 8. Seems like an awful long way. Wait, well, what's the reticence? It would seem to be a submission you have maximum leverage with the author to apply.
So my take on this is, first of all, if you require something, you have to do your homework first. And the biggest challenge for us, and I think that's also true for funders, institutions, is ORCID is nice to link to the outside world, but if your internal systems are a mess, that's not really helpful. And there's a lot of work to be done everywhere, and that includes publishers and it includes us. So even if you would require this would create a lot of work you couldn't handle because your systems aren't ready. And the other aspect, like everything you burden researchers with, is you have to strike a balance. You cannot just say, well, let's do that. And if anyone could do that, it's rather funders than publishers, I would think. So that's why there's a practical reason, and there's also a sort of conceptual reason for that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different reasons. Part of it's the carrot of the stick right now. It's hard to explain to every author how this benefits them exactly at that point that they're doing it, because the benefit they get is a lot further downstream. And a lot of that benefit depends on all these systems working together. So until every system's playing well, or a significant majority of systems, and people start to see other authors benefiting from it, it can be quite tough. And the biggest thing is it's an extra click. Submission processes for articles are already not as simple as anyone would like them to be, I think. So adding any extra step and making it mandatory is something that very few publishers are going to be willing to do until every other publisher also does the same thing.
So I'll just add that we're close to playing chicken with that and are seriously thinking about it. Probably our biggest hurdle is not the extra click, it's the co-author problem, and that many papers are submitted right when their co-authors are going off in the earth sciences to Antarctica for many months. And the question is, do we hold up a paper because the 10th co-author isn't reachable immediately and hasn't filled out their ORCID profile? And I think, to me, that's the higher, the higher profile of, really, really, truly requiring it.
Anything else that would probably here is that to distill that, I think that I will remind you that the ORCID registry is only about 1.5 years old, and I think that with all things, it's sort of about maturity and timing. And as Michael really said, it's about having some maturity throughout the ecosystem. And I think that we're seeing lots of activity in lots of different places. And I think but I would say certainly we're not kind of at that point yet. We're beginning to see funders beginning to require this. I think we'll be beginning to see more of that. But it's taking researchers hearing about ORCID and having that awareness from the publishing community, from their professional societies, which are really important for their professional identities, from their universities, probably most importantly from their departments, which is even harder to drill down into, and especially from funding organizations. It's working through all of those things and people hearing the messages over and over and over, which they're beginning to get. But again, after 1.5 years, we're sort of just beginning to reach, get close to that, I think.
The comment about the funders is a critical one. If you're a Portuguese researcher and you see it anywhere that you can enter your ORCID right now in any submission system, you assume that thing is mandatory.
Other questions? Please.
Is there any initial feedback as to the resistance due to the privacy concern by the researcher community with these so many branches now?
I'll start with, I know that Martin will also have comments from the European community. You know, we get asked about privacy. We go to professional meetings, we talk with researchers, but by and large, most people tend to sort of say, wow, that's a pretty good idea. So that we get questions about privacy, especially from the European community, which I think Martin can elaborate on. But generally, it's also important to remember, I mean, if you've created your ORCID ID, what did we ask you for? We asked you for your name and your email address. We aren't collecting a lot of additional information. So there's, you know, even for record creation in the United States, for students, which is governed under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, which is a federal policy that is about the disclosure of information about students. Even with that, because we don't collect anything that's not considered directory information, we're well within those guidelines, and we have universities that are creating records for their students. So not a lot of concerns that we're hearing, but...
Well, I would like to add two aspects. One is that ORCID as an organization, and I was involved in many of these discussions early on, is very concerned about privacy, and this actually led to practicability issues. So, for example, in the very beginning, every publication by default was private. Nobody else would see that this is part of your profile. So there was some reconsideration, and now it's a little bit easier to say when you create an ORCID, everything that I add as a publication should be public, but you can also decide, as Rebecca said, everything is not public, because there's not only private and public, but also there's an intermediate level where you can share information with people you choose to. The other aspect I wanted to mention is that I'm from Germany, and we care a little bit more about privacy on average than Americans. And one recent new member of ORCID had many concerns about privacy, and the concern here is really research evaluation. So that if it's an institution becoming a member, that was the case, it's really about all the employees feeling that now they're sort of, it's easier to look into what they are doing, that administration can just push a button, so to speak, and they can see that. And that's, I guess, a real concern, and but that's a much bigger question than just ORCID.
Just to follow up, what about the concern that prone to fraud? Somebody using well-publicized ORCID ID to appear, to pretend to be the author?
So I'll repeat the question. So you're talking about somebody could create an ORCID ID or use as somebody else. Yeah. I mean, I think that we don't check passports. We're not. We are an identification number that is self-claimed by researchers. My first response to that, and what many of you know, there are always cases of fraud in the community, but we also have a system that actually is self-regulating very well most of the time. And I think that those things are no different within the ORCID environment. Additionally, though, if we do have a situation where that were to take place, we have a dispute resolution sort of process that we will go through. We have yet to have that happen, but we have an outline process for managing that. Michael.
I'll just add one other thing, which is, I think, as Rebecca mentioned in her talk, is that the recommended, or strongly recommended implementation for publishers is never to allow someone to type in their ORCID. The only way that we have an ORCID integration is you actually have to go to ORCID and sign up with your account. If the login and password is the same as ours, it just passes through. But if it's different, you have to log into your ORCID. So you can't just write in somebody else's ORCID and pretend to be that somebody else.
So we have a very good kind of parallel example from Scopus. Our Scopus author profiles are Scopus is used for national assessments, UK, Australia, Italy, Portugal. It's very sensitive, to say the least, because this is the official document of what people have published in their citation record. We have been getting manual feedback corrections for a number of years now, hundreds of thousands. And each one of those, up until just a couple months ago, went through a help desk. and had an individual person look at those hundreds of thousands of requests to correct profiles, we've never had a single case of fraud. And we're not even requiring people to log in or anything. Anyone can give feedback on any profile. There was once someone who was overly enthusiastic and made a mistake as he was trying to correct too many profiles, but that's the only case where anything happened. So it's very self-regulating. People are they know they'll get caught by someone else in their department or elsewhere.
I just want to add one other aspect, which is if you feel uncomfortable that the researcher can go to ORCID and just claim he published these 10 papers, which he hadn't, especially if his name is Smith and it's difficult to track that, then you have to think about who would be in the position to better say that he's the author for those papers. And if you think about there is no single one, it's not the publisher, it's not the institution. And I think the approach ORCID is taking is both a pragmatic one for this reason, and what the ORCID system is doing is actually saying, well, both the publisher and the author say this is the publication of this person, and you can decide for yourself when you use ORCID data, you only trust things that have been not just self-claimed, but also verified from other sources, like the institution or the publisher or the funder. And the second part is really for the systems to gain traction. It's again the question earlier about requiring ORCIDs. If you have a system that not only is required, but also the researcher has no control what goes in there, that's really top-down, and that isn't really helpful for adoption. So you really have to give the researcher a chance to say, well, this is what I did, and I don't want both in what's part of their profile, but also what's public and private. Otherwise, this is really a hard sell.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, from an implementation perspective, what about historical works? Do you just say, okay, from day one from submission, we now start tracking ORCIDs and then we'll allow authors to claim past papers at some point when they can bother to do it? Or do you yourself, because you've got 4, 5, 6 different people databases in various guises, do you say, right, this author's claimed this article, therefore we know that this author in this system also created all of these, we'll do it for them? How does it work?
Mike, please.
Well, that's what I wanted to get at, that I think there are different approaches. I think the pragmatic approach is forget about the past. Depends on how old you are as a publisher. PLOS is 11 years old, but maybe the Royal Society has different views on past. The other aspect is ORCID is only for living people. That's because that's the very nature of self-claiming. So ORCID will never go back like DOIs at some point went back to a few hundred years. I think it's the middle ground. If you just look forward, that's probably not all the information you want to get, but it's probably not the first thing you want to do.
You also have a question.
I have kind of a follow-up question in the same realm, which is, I thought you had some really interesting things to say about people adding ORCID information to Scopus, but I guess I'm kind of, I'm sure that there eventually, kind of as this grows, there's going to be, people who've got papers with ORCIDs and Scopus, and people who've got ORCIDs in ORCID, and Crossref has ORCID information, and eventually the publishers are going to want some of this sort of, what are the feeds back and forth? Like, are you sending, if somebody puts their ID into Scopus, are you sending that to ORCID then? Are you going to send that back to publishers at their request?
Yes, so we don't send it back to ORCID at this point in time. The researcher themselves has to go in and push that document. So if you looked at that graph of Portugal, very few people had it, a whole bunch did it, and now you can see any time a researcher publishes a new document, they're using Scopus to push that over to ORCID. We don't have permissions in that way because it's very much up to the power of the researcher. I think there's plans with Crossref, though, that you might want
Yes. So it's really important for publication information, once you've collected that through manuscript submission, for that to carry through the process. It goes to Crossref. part of what I think will start to add a lot of convenience for researchers is for that information, once it's been minted with a DOI, for that information then to come back to us and to be able to fairly automatically update their record. Just what that looks like, we're still discussing. But that's something that we're planning for this calendar year, so in the next 6 months or so. I think that's something that's also going to be really important for helping to increase the awareness and understanding of the researchers of how this actually really benefits them. They understand it from a name ambiguity issue, but they may not also. It sort of depends upon, is that their personal problem? But they all share the personal problem of, I have information in all of these different places. And once they can start to see how those systems are really talking, that's really going to help. So that is that we're going to be able to see more of that. We also see cases, as Brooks talks about using the API to be able to share information, or to include the ORCID ID as part of a membership renewal. And I think we also have opportunities for organizations to share information such as affiliation information. So users can now go in and indicate where they did their degrees, who their current employer is, and we work with Ringgold, use the Ringgold data to indicate that list of possible employers or institutions where they get their degree. I think increasingly as we work with the university community, we'll also be able to have them share that information through the API and to indicate that. We also have a multiple assertions working group, and that has recently made some recommendations that we'll be working to implement also here in 2014. And that also provides some additional information about where the data is coming from. And we'll be working to add that information to the ORCID record to better clarify, was this self-asserted by the researcher? Was this asserted by the university? Was this asserted by the publisher? Did this come from Crossref? And then I think that additionally also gives us additional confidence about the quality of the record.
Just want to add, I think it's an excellent question, because that's a big problem, that information can sit in many different places and it's not connected to each other. And one very good example relates to your question, which is the way Crossref is set up. The only people who can push information to Crossref are the publishers, which means even if ORCID wanted to, there's no way you can get this information into the Crossref system directly. So the only way to do this, unless you rethink a lot of things, is really that the publisher takes information from ORCID, thinks about it, looks at it, says this is really true, and then pushes this to Crossref. And that sounds complicated, but it makes sure that there's some system in how the information is updated. But that's why this thinking about the publication that have already happened and thinking about the past is important.
One more comment. This does also get back to my first point, which is the most important part is to connect all these different identities. The ORCID record itself doesn't necessarily need to be the place where all the documents are stored, as long as it's connected to wherever those associations are.
So ORCID solves for which of the many John Smiths you want. Now, how do we avoid the John Smith having 6 or 7 ORCID IDs? We're doing mass enrollments through institutions. They're signing up 10,000 scholars en masse. Or potentially you have, I know I'm guilty of this, cover my passwords and sign on to a commenting string on New York Times, so I'll just sign up under different
Yeah, and I think that I have 2 responses to that. One is we can't avoid it. Duplicates will be created. We can't not move forward because we're afraid of this. It will happen. So we have a process to deprecate records when we discover them. So people just need to work with us, and we'll very quickly get them deprecated so that no matter which number you have, it will always point to 1. We won't delete the other record. So even if your institution has collected the first one, they can be connected together. Okay, so yes, I think it will happen, and I think also, the other response I have is that Texas A&M, as I mentioned, created records for their 10,000 graduate students. Gail Clement from Texas A&M is here at this meeting, so if you want to learn more about that, she's here. She's been leading that project. And I think out of those 10,000 records, they ended up with about 60 duplicates. So not an insignificant number, but also a fairly small percentage of that. I think that as ORCID becomes more widespread, this becomes more possible. And so we recognize that. And that's where I actually want to appeal to all of you, is that ORCID is very much a community-driven effort. We have a very small, lightweight staff, and we're very much dependent upon our member organizations, our volunteers. We have a group of about 80 outreach ambassadors, including Michael, who are really helping us to spread the word. But we actually rely upon every single individual in the community to play a role of leadership, and that includes including the ORCID ID in your slides, helping to raise awareness, put it in your email signature, basically helping to communicate to everybody within our community that your ORCID ID is part of your scholarly identity. It should be there. It's just like your name, except it's better than your name, because if you're trying to find my works as R. Bryant, you're going to find sociologists and dance scholars and all sorts of other people who aren't me. But we appreciate your partnership and for all of us to be working together to help educate the researchers. Because I think also as we have awareness grows, then we can have less concern about this. But for a while, I think it's going to get a little messier before it gets cleaner. Are there other questions? All right, I want to thank all of our panelists, and thank you for being an attentive audience.